Plant pathogens. Definition of a pathogen is basically what we would call a germ. Wash your hands, you might have germs on them. These include quite a few different kinds of microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses. Examples that we're familiar with of human pathogens, rhinovirus, chickenpox is another kind of virus disease. Colds and the flu are caused by viruses. Streptococcus causes a lot of different infections. That's a bacterium. And athlete's foot is a fungus. In humans, the fungi are the hardest to fight off because they're much closer to humans than the rest of them, so it's difficult to kill them without killing us. What is a plant disease? Similar to humans, it can be called a malfunctioning of a plant caused by a continuous irritation from a pathogen. Disease is looked at as a disease triangle in plants, a combination of the host, which is the plant, the environment, and the pathogen. And then, of course, over time, these interact. The amount of disease or the development of disease is affected by a variety of things. The host may be susceptible or resistant, particularly in plants. We've developed a lot of plants that are resistant to some of the common disease agents. And then again, the pathogen may be weak or strong. Some of them sometimes figure out how to get around host resistance, or they just may be generally virulent. Maybe they're not native, so they don't have anything to keep them in check. And then the environment can come together to favor both. It may help support the host to fight off the pathogen, or then again it may harm the host and give the pathogen a leg up. So the combination of those three leads to disease and also the degree of disease. Some examples of plant pathogens. Biological pathogens, which would be microbes as a general rule. Fungi are the biggest enemies of plants, which is interesting considering the importance of fungi and symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizae. Fungi also have co-evolved with plants to form all sorts of pathogens that cause disease. Estimated up to 85% of plant diseases are fungal related. Bacteria cause some problems, but just not nearly the level that you see with fungi. There's another type of microbe called a mycoplasma that can cause problems, but again, compared to fungi, not much. There are viruses, estimated over 1,000 plant pathogens or viruses, and some of those are economically very devastating. Nematodes are tiny little worms, and many of those are plant parasites. They often on roots, but also sometimes above ground. There are parasitic plants that are a problem, but they are fairly rare and fairly novel. And of course, insects may not necessarily cause disease directly, but their chewing and sucking problems can add to plant stress, and then in the process of chewing or sucking, many insects transmit other pathogens. They will carry bacterial spores, viruses. Many are transmitted by leafhoppers and other insects. So insects can be what they call a vector. Now there's some non-biological examples of plant pathogens. Environmental examples are, just what you'd expect. It's too hot or it's too cold, it's too wet or too dry, it's too dark or it's too bright. Also, in some cases, a lack of oxygen can be a problem, and air pollution, which can lead to a lack of oxygen, and a host of other problems, acid rain and smog and particulates in the air that limit light. There are chemical things that can cause disease, nutrient deficiencies. If there's not enough nitrogen, not enough of some micronutrients, any of those can lead to a stressed plant that then causes disease. Conversely, you can have too much of some nutrients, or you can have some minerals that are not nutrients at all that can cause disease. The soil can be too acidic or too alkaline, to the opposite of acidic. And then much damage to plants agriculturally, horticulturally, is done by improper application of pesticides, either the wrong pesticide for the disease at hand or too high of a dose. The wrong day, too hot, too windy, can cause disease. And then mechanical issues, just plain breaking the plants from wind or hail or lightning, snow late in the year or early in the year. And lawnmowers, of course, can do a serious amount of damage, as can other things that mechanically damage trees. Disease management is a combination of approaches. It's very important to try and balance all the different things you're trying to do as far as management. The most important thing you can do is reduce the amount of disease pathogen units that are there, whether they're spores or viruses or whatever. Crop rotation is a response to pathogens. By putting a different crop in the ground every year, last year's pathogen doesn't have the right plant to infect, and so it dies out. So you make dramatic leaps ahead in planting in ground that hasn't had the same species recently. Removing your plant debris, whether it's in a garden or in a large scale operation. The many pathogens will overwinter, will multiply in the debris or in the soil. So many different ways to reduce the amount of inoculum. You need to be careful you don't create another problem, though. Some people will think, well, I've got this pathogen in my soil, so I'll just sterilize my soil. Well, then that opens the soil up to all sorts of other things that can move in when there's no competition, and you can very likely cause worse problems than you had to begin with. Barriers are important. You can see the bananas there on the lower right. As soon as they're done pollinating, they cover them with a plastic sheath, and that dramatically reduces fungi that get on them and cause different rots. It's important to look into what caused your disease. You don't just look at the plant and think, oh, well, that's probably a fungus, and spray it with a fungicide. You really need to try and figure out the disease agent, and then think about what the environment has been recently that might have encouraged the development of that disease, and see if it's something you can control. If you've been irrigating routinely, maybe you need to irrigate less. There's a wide variety of things that sometimes are under mechanical control, rather than just sort of a knee-jerk response. Very important to use varieties that have been shown to be resistant to different diseases. That can just make life a whole lot easier, even if you have the disease agents present. If your plant is resistant, it's like getting a vaccination by humans. You need to optimize your chemical uses. Again, make sure you're using the right chemical for the right agent, and then that you're using it in the right conditions and the right amounts. Any of those things can make a huge difference in the efficacy of your chemical application. And the bottom line is it's very important to balance all facets of management. One thing that is important to know, many introduced pathogens are some of our worst invasive species. As an invasive disease species. They often are things that local plants have not been exposed to, so they're not resistant to the introduced pathogens, and additionally pathogens usually have no competition or predators to help keep them under control. It's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent in the U.S. from introduced pathogens. We lost all our chestnuts from an Asian chestnut blight disease. We lost our Dutch elms or our elm trees from a disease that was brought in from Europe. White pine blister rust has wiped out millions of white pines. Avocado plantations have been lost to a foreign disease. And those are just 4 examples of dozens of truly tragic and expensive situations that have arisen by nonchalant transfer of biological materials from one continent to the next. Some common diseases. Blight is called blight because the plants look pretty darn miserable. It's a bacterial infection, which is fire blight is a bacterial infection, causes a lot of agricultural damage to our fruit trees. There are also some fungal blights. They're generally called blight because they happen quickly. The plant fails very quickly. They are often the source of conditions where you need to just put the plant in a different place and plant something different there. The late blight caused the Irish potato famine. A perfect example of too much of a susceptible species planted in far too wide of an area, and no alternative species, no alternative production going on. Canker is another common plant disease. It's formed by a couple different kinds of fungi. called canker because they look like a large blistery, often weepy kind of area on the plant. Nectar canker is kind of interesting in that it just about always produces orange little bodies outside of the plant, which are the fungus actually coming out to fruit. Rots, there's a lot of different kinds of plant rots. Some on, you can see soybean root rot on the left, and a couple wood rot fungi, shelf fungi on some trees on the right. These often are fatal. They get in and they block up translocation of sugars in water and kill the tree they're on. Sometimes they're on dead trees where they're just breaking down dead wood. Rusts are very common, named because they look like rusty areas in the plants. That's actually large patches of spores of the fungus that is living inside the plant, and then fruiting on the outside of the plant. Wheat rust is an enormous problem, as is cedar apple rust. Some of these are sort of interesting in that they actually have two hosts. So one stage of the plant of the fungi's life cycle will be on one plant, and then the alternate stage of life cycle will be on another plant. So sometimes in that case, like for example, you have an apple orchard with cedar apple rust. If you can get rid of the cedars that are nearby, the apple rust will die out because it doesn't have its alternate host. Took a long time to figure that one out for scientists. Wilts are another common disease, very often fungal. They are named because the plant actually wilts. It wilts because the disease pathogen has gotten into the xylem, the transportation pathway of the plants, and causes the tissue that is outboard of the blockage to die because it's no longer being supported by the root system. Galls are little lumpy things of a huge variety of types and pathogens that cause them. Many are like on the lower right, which is an insect has poked a hole in that plant and laid an egg, and then the plant forms the gall around it, and the insect larva develops in there, eventually chews itself a little hole and leaves, and the plant goes on to be fairly normal. These things you see on the bottom right, crown gall, much more serious, often result in, if not a dead plant, at least a plant that no longer produces any viable fruit. Many more diseases out there. Anthracnose we often see on sycamores in central Iowa in the spring. They just get this sick-looking look to the leaves. Sometimes if it's a wet spring, all the leaves fall off, and then a new set of leaves are formed later in the summer when the anthracnose fungus is no longer being favored by the cool, wet spring. Downy mildew, another extremely common one. Powdery mildew you can see on lilac on the right. You often see plants later in the summer they just look like they've been dusted with flour, and it's actually the spores of a fungus. Clubroot, molds, smuts, scabs, and then of course diseases due to mechanical wounding. Routinely being hit by lawnmowers, different things that will cause diseased tissue to develop. Another important thing to remember is more than one disease can occur together. So if you're trying to figure out what disease is on your plant, it's not going to be just one thing. Oftentimes, particularly in a stress plant, one disease starts sort of beating up on it, and then other secondary diseases can come in. Finally, we've been having sort of a run on largest of things, another claim for the largest organism on the earth. In Oregon, there was a continuous growth of mycelium, which is fungus. That covered 240 acres, which is hard to kind of get your head around, as is 1,700 football fields, but at least you can understand it's a lot of football fields. They estimate it weighed many tons, different estimates, 10 to 35,000 tons. Age, they actually did some radiocarbon dating on it, so they know it was very old, and it is a pathogen of conifer trees, kills the conifers that it's around. For good, better or worse, it was cut up by a housing division that went in, but there's still a lot of it left there. That includes our plant pathogen report.